The smell of pine and cold air was the last thing I remembered before everything went wrong. I know how that sounds. Like the opening of one of those thriller novels you pick up at an airport bookstore and finish before landing. But this wasn't fiction. This was a Tuesday in November. And I was standing in the arrivals hall of Vancouver International Airport with 2 suitcases, a boarding pass stub in my coat pocket, and the slow, creeping realization that the man I had trusted with my whole life had just handed me over to someone else. Let me back up. My name is Zoe, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, which tells you something right away if you're Canadian. Sudbury isn't a place people fantasize. It's nickel mines and Canadian shield rock and winters that feel personal, like the cold has something against you specifically. My mother raised me alone in a house on Kathleen Street, 2 blocks from the grocery store where she worked the overnight shift for 17 years. She didn't complain, she just worked. That was her language, showing up every single day, regardless of what the day asked of her. She died when I was 26. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in February, gone by August. 6 months. I didn't have time to understand what was happening before it was already over. The only thing she left me, besides the house, which I eventually had to sell to cover the medical debts that piled up even with OHIP. Because OHIP doesn't cover everything. Not the supplements, not the parking at the cancer center, not the 100 small expenses that nobody warns you about. Was a brooch. It's a small thing. Silver, about the size of a toonie, shaped like a moth with its wings spread open. The detail is extraordinary. You can see the individual scales on the wings if you hold it in the light at the right angle. My mother wore it on her coat every winter for as long as I can remember. She never explained where it came from, just said it had been in the family a long time, and that I should keep it close. I had it pinned to the inside lining of my coat, not on display. Just there. A habit. Like carrying her with me. I met my boyfriend at a work conference in Toronto. He was charming in the way that, in retrospect, should have been a warning sign. Effortlessly comfortable in any room, able to talk to anyone. The kind of person who makes you feel like you're the most interesting person they've encountered in years. I fell for it completely. We dated for 2 years. He was generous, attentive, made plans. He talked about the future in a way that felt solid, real. He suggested I leave my contract work as a financial analyst and come work for his company as a consultant. Better money, he said, more flexibility, and we'd get to travel together. I quit my contract. That was the first mistake. The second was believing him when he said the trip to Vancouver was a business opportunity. His company, or what I thought was his company, had a partnership meeting on the West Coast. He needed me there as a financial consultant. I'd be sitting in on meetings, reviewing documents, presenting analysis. It sounded legitimate because every detail he gave me sounded legitimate. He was very good at that. We flew out on a Sunday. He was quieter than usual on the plane, I noticed but didn't push. He sometimes got like that before big meetings, tension running underneath the surface. I ordered a ginger ale and watched the prairies flatten out below us and thought about nothing in particular. The hotel was in Richmond, nice enough. Not ostentatious, but clean, with thick curtains and a view of the mountains when the fog cleared. He told me to get some rest, that the meeting was early. I slept heavily, the way you do when your body doesn't know yet that something is wrong. In the morning, he was already dressed when I woke up. Suit. Tie. He said. The client had sent a car. He handed me a travel mug of coffee. He kissed me on the forehead. He was gone before I finished the coffee. The car that arrived was a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who didn't make eye contact. I assumed this was normal. Rich clients had drivers who didn't make small talk. I got in with my laptop bag and my coat and my notes, and we drove for 40 minutes into an area of the city I didn't recognize. Not downtown, not somewhere I'd been before. Industrial, but not rough. The kind of neighborhood that looks like nothing until you're already inside it. The building we pulled up to was unremarkable. Warehouse exterior. But inside, it was different. I stepped through a side door into a space that had been converted into something that looked halfway between a private lounge and an office. Leather furniture, low lighting. A bar along one wall, security cameras in every corner. There were men there. 3 of them, standing, and then a 4th, sitting at a table in the center of the room, watching the door the way a person watches something they've been waiting for. My boyfriend was not there. I said his name out loud. His name and a question mark, like a reflex, and the man at the table smiled. Not warmly. "He's not coming," the man said. His name, I would learn later, was Aldous. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of someone who has never once been the most frightened person in a room. He looked at me the way you look at a document you've been expecting to receive. It took me about 45 seconds to understand what was happening. And those 45 seconds are the ones I replay sometimes when I'm not expecting to, standing in the shower or falling asleep or driving somewhere ordinary. The shift from confusion to comprehension is not a dramatic thing. It's quiet. It lands like a stone dropped into still water, not a crash but a ripple that keeps expanding outward. My boyfriend had sold me. I don't have a more clinical way to put it. He had made arrangements with this man, received something in exchange, money, a debt cleared, I still don't know the full details, and delivered me to Vancouver under a pretense that I had believed entirely because I had no reason not to. I did not scream. I don't know why. Maybe shock. Maybe the instinct that screaming in a room full of men who've already bought you is not a useful strategy. I stood very still and I asked what he wanted. Aldous started to speak. Something about the arrangements, about the terms, about what came next. I was listening, but also not listening. The way your brain splits when it's trying to survive. One part processing words, another part looking for exits, another part still trying to find a version of events where this wasn't real. And then he stopped talking. He stopped mid-sentence, and his eyes dropped to my coat. I had shrugged it off my shoulders slightly when I came inside. It was warm in the building, and it had fallen open at the lapel. The interior lining was visible, the brooch was visible. Aldous stood up slowly from the table. The men along the walls didn't move. But something changed in the room. The atmosphere shifted the way it does before a storm. Not louder, quieter. He crossed the room and stopped in front of me. He was looking at my coat, at the moth brooch pinned to the inside lining, and his expression was something I had seen in a stranger's face before. Not menace, not curiosity. Something older than both of those things. "Where did you get that?" he said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. It was my mother's. The silence that followed was very long. "What was your mother's name?" he asked. And the way he asked it, quietly, carefully, like the question was something fragile, made every hair on my arms stand up. "Why?" I said. He looked up from the brooch and met my eyes. For the first time since I'd walked through that door, I had the strange sensation that I was the one with power in this room. I didn't know why. I didn't understand it. But I felt it. "Because," Aldous said slowly, "that brooch was made by hand. There were only 3 ever made, by a woman named Suzanne Thibodeau, in 1987. She gave one to each of her daughters. He paused. And I knew all three of them. My mother's name was Suzanne. I never knew her maiden name. She never used it. She was always just my mother. Suzanne, who worked nights at the grocery store, who wore a silver moth on her coat every winter, who told me nothing about where she came from, and who died before I thought to ask the questions that mattered. I told him her name. The change in Aldis's face was immediate and absolute. He turned away from me, walked back to the table, and stood there with his back to the room for what felt like a full minute. When he turned around again, he was different, not softer exactly. But something had been reorganized behind his eyes. "Sit down," he said, and then to the other men, "Leave us." I don't know why I sat. Some calculation below the level of conscious thought that this was safer than whatever the alternative was. I sat in one of the leather chairs and he sat across from me, and he told me about my mother. Her real name was Suzanne Thibodeau, as he'd said. She came from a family in Montreal. Old money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself. That moves quietly through charitable foundations and property holdings and family trusts administered by lawyers who have been with the family for 3 generations. Her father had been connected. Not in any explicit criminal sense, but in the way that old Quebec money sometimes is, entangled with things that don't bear too much scrutiny. Aldis had been a young man working in that world when he first met my mother and her sisters. He had loved one of them. Not my mother, her sister, before everything fell apart. When my mother was 22, she found out something about her father. Something that she apparently decided she could not live alongside. She left, cut everything off, changed her name through the courts, moved to Northern Ontario, disappeared into the kind of ordinary life that is the best camouflage there is. She never told anyone. In the family where she went. For 30 years they had been looking, intermittently, in the way that people look for things they've mostly given up on, and my boyfriend, who I had trusted, who I had built 2 years of my life with, had found out somehow. I still don't know how. Whether he'd been paid to find out, or whether he'd stumbled into it and recognized the value, or whether the entire relationship had been engineered from the beginning, I've stopped trying to reconstruct it. Some things you don't get clean answers to, and spending your life trying to find them is its own kind of trap. What I know is that he'd sold information. Sold me, essentially, my location and my access. To someone in my mother's family's world. To Aldis, who despite everything was not what I initially feared. He wasn't looking to hurt me. He was looking, I think, for some remnant of a woman he had never stopped thinking about. My mother's sister, the one he'd loved, had died years ago. My mother was gone. I was what was left. That doesn't excuse what happened. I want to be precise about that. Aldis didn't physically harm me. And when he understood who I was, he called off whatever arrangement had been made, clearly and immediately. But I had been brought there against my will. I had been deceived and transported and delivered like a package. That is what it was. Regardless of the complicating factors. Regardless of Aldis's particular grief. And his complicated relationship with my family's past. What I felt, sitting in that chair in that converted warehouse in Richmond, was something I'm still learning the vocabulary for. It wasn't only fear, though there had been fear. It was a specific kind of grief. The grief of discovering that the person you loved saw you as currency, as something to be exchanged, that underneath the 2 years and the plans and the forehead kisses, and the travel mug of coffee, there had been a calculation running the entire time. Aldis drove me back to the hotel himself. He didn't say much on the way. Before I got out of the car, he took something from the glove compartment. A photograph, old. The colors slightly faded. The way photographs from the late 80s fade, and handed it to me. 3 young women standing in front of what looked like a house in Outremont, snow on the ground. One of them was my mother. I recognized her cheekbones, her posture, the particular way she held herself like she was bracing for something. She was wearing the moth brooch on her coat. I took the photograph. I didn't say thank you. I got out of the car and went up to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since she died. Not prettily, not quietly, but the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below the chest, from the place where you store the things you can't afford to feel at regular intervals. I booked a new flight home that afternoon, not to Sudbury. There was no house to go back to anymore, but to Toronto, where my best friend from university, a woman named Petra who had seen me through every difficult thing, had an apartment and a couch, and the good sense to not ask too many questions when I called her from the airport. I told her I needed to come. She said, "Come." On the plane, I thought about my mother, about the life she had built from nothing, from a deliberate erasure of who she had been. And the 17 years at the grocery store, and the 2-bedroom house and the sons she'd raised to be okay in a world that had not always been kind to either of them. I had spent 5 years being angry at her for not telling me where we came from. Now, I understood that she had done it to protect me. She had walked away from something that was not safe, and she had never looked back. And she had worn a small silver moth on the inside of her coat, like a private signal to herself. A reminder of who she had been and what she had chosen to leave behind. I understand now, in a way I couldn't before, what it costs to start over. What it actually costs. Not the romantic version of it, not the clean slate fantasy, but the daily weight of a story you can never fully tell anyone. A past that sits just underneath the ordinary surface of your life. When I landed in Toronto and walked through the arrivals hall and saw Petra, standing at the barrier with a coffee in each hand, and that specific expression she gets when she's worried but is trying. Not to show it. Something in me released. Not everything. Not the anger at my ex, which would take years to process, and not the grief for my mother, which I think will be with me in some form forever. But something. She didn't ask questions. We drove to her apartment in Scarborough, and she made pasta, and we watched a documentary about marine biology, and at some point she put a blanket over me without waking me up. And when I woke up at 3 in the morning with the city quiet outside the window, I lay there for a long time, thinking about nothing and everything, and specifically about my mother, standing in the snow in Montreal, young and alive, wearing that silver moth. I still have it pinned to the inside of my coat. I put it there every morning. It's not a talisman, not exactly. I don't believe in that, but I believe in the small, deliberate acts of carrying something forward, of saying, by the act of wearing a thing, that the person who wore it before you still matters. That the story doesn't end just because the person does. The photograph sits on my bookshelf now in a small frame. 3 sisters in the snow. My mother, 22 years old, squinting a little at the camera. A whole life still ahead of her. A different life than the one she would choose. But still ahead. I know her maiden name now. I know where she came from. I know the shape of the thing she ran from, which is also in its way, the shape of the thing that saved me in that room, in Richmond. She gave me that, without knowing it. Without being able to warn me or explain or be there when it mattered, she still protected me. That's the kind of mother she was. Even from the other side of everything, she was still looking out for me. Through a silver moth on a coat lining. Through a name that stopped a room cold. through a story she never told me but left behind in every quiet, stubborn, uncomplaining way she lived. I told Petra about all of it, eventually. Not that night. But, a few weeks later, over tea in her kitchen, on a Sunday morning, when the light was coming through the window at the right angle, and it felt possible to say things out loud, she listened the whole way through without interrupting. Which, if you knew Petra, you'd understand, is a significant act of restraint. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your mom was kind of a badass." And I laughed. The real kind, the kind that surprises you. Yeah, I said, she really was. I'm still working out what to do with the rest of the story. The parts about the family in Montreal. The things Aldous told me. The documents he sent afterward with a lawyer's card. And a note that said simply, "This belongs to you." That's a longer road, and I'm not ready to walk all of it yet. But I'm not running from it either. My mother ran. I understand why, but I think I'm going to do something different. I think I'm going to walk toward it slowly, carefully, with my eyes open and her brooch on the inside of my coat, and figure out who I come from. Not to reclaim it, not to belong to it, but just to know. To carry the whole story instead of only the part I was given. She deserved to be known fully. And so do I.